My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Melissa at 11:47 p.m. "Don't bother showing up tomorrow, Sophia. You're no longer welcome at my wedding." Little did she know, I was about to cancel the venue she'd been planning her dream wedding at for 8 months. Because I owned it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stared at the message on my phone screen, sitting in my home office in Millbrook Heights, surrounded by contracts and financial documents that told a very different story than what my family believed about my life. At 28, I was supposedly the family disappointment, the sister who wasted her business degree working at some little event planning company downtown, living in what they assumed was a cramped apartment, driving a modest Honda Civic that was 3 years old. What they didn't know was that the little event planning company was Grandview Events Hospitality, which I'd built from nothing into a multi-million-dollar empire over the past 6 years. The company owned 12 premium venues across the tri-state area, including Rosewood Estate, the stunning lakeside mansion where Melissa was supposed to marry her fiancé Brandon tomorrow afternoon. I leaned back in my leather chair, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my actual home, a custom-built contemporary house on 47 acres of private land, worth more than my parents' house and Melissa's new condo combined. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family pitied me for my struggling lifestyle, I'd been quietly building something extraordinary. The text from Melissa was the culmination of months of increasing hostility. It had started when she announced her engagement to Brandon Keller, a pharmaceutical sales rep she'd met at a conference. From the moment she started planning, Melissa had made it clear that she wanted her wedding to be perfect, and that my presence somehow threatened that perfection. "Sophia just doesn't fit the aesthetic I'm going for," she'd told our mother, not realizing I could hear every word from the kitchen. "All my friends are successful, put-together people. Brandon's family is very well connected. I can't have my struggling sister there making everyone uncomfortable with questions about why she's still single and working some dead-end job." Our mother, Patricia Hartwell, had tried to mediate, but even she shared Melissa's concerns. "Maybe Sophia could help with some of the behind-the-scenes work," she'd suggested. "She does have experience with events, even if it's small-scale stuff." Small-scale stuff. If they only knew that small-scale stuff included managing the governor's daughter's wedding last month or the tech billionaire's anniversary party I'd coordinated in Malibu 3 weeks ago. But I'd learned long ago that explaining my actual success to my family only led to accusations of lying or showing off. It was easier to let them assume what they wanted to assume. The final straw had come this afternoon during what was supposed to be the rehearsal dinner. Melissa had reserved a private dining room at Costello's, an upscale Italian restaurant in the historic district. I'd arrived wearing a simple navy dress and minimal jewelry, my usual understated style that my family interpreted as trying to look expensive on a budget. Brandon's parents, Richard and Eleanor Keller, were everything Melissa had described: wealthy, connected, and very concerned with appearances. Richard owned 3 car dealerships across the state, and Eleanor served on the boards of several prominent charities. They'd spent the entire cocktail hour discussing their recent trip to their vacation home in Martha's Vineyard and their son's promising career trajectory. "And what do you do, Sophia?" Eleanor had asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer wouldn't impress her. "I work in event planning," I'd replied simply. "Oh, how lovely," she'd said with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Small parties, corporate luncheons, that sort of thing?" Before I could answer, Melissa had jumped in. "Sophia works for a local company. Nothing too fancy, but she's good at organizing things." The dismissive tone in her voice was unmistakable. What followed was 20 minutes of the Kellers discussing their own event planning experiences, the charity galas they'd hosted, the corporate events they'd attended, the real event planners they'd worked with for serious occasions. Each story was clearly meant to illustrate the difference between their world and what they assumed was mine. The breaking point came when Eleanor mentioned that they'd initially wanted to hold the wedding at Rosewood Estate. "It's absolutely stunning," she'd gushed. "Right on Lake Serenity, with those gorgeous gardens and the historic mansion. But it's so exclusive. There's apparently a waiting list, and they only work with certain planners. We tried to book it, but they said they were completely booked for the next 2 years." I'd nearly choked on my water. Rosewood Estate had been fully booked because I'd made the decision 18 months ago to limit weddings to 12 per year, focusing on ultra-high-end events that maintained the venue's exclusivity. The Kellers had been turned away, not because of a waiting list, but because their inquiry had been during our brief period of restructuring after I'd acquired 2 additional properties. "Well," Richard had said, "Brandon and Melissa found something even better. Rosewood Estate might be exclusive, but Willowbrook Gardens has its own charm, and it was available on their date, which shows they were meant to be." Willowbrook Gardens. The venue Melissa had booked after being rejected by Rosewood. The venue she'd spent months raving about, calling it even more perfect than her original choice. The venue that was, in fact, also mine, part of my portfolio of premium properties that I'd acquired and developed over the past 3 years. That's when Melissa had delivered her final blow. "Actually," she'd announced, her voice carrying clearly, across the private dining room, "I need to make an announcement about tomorrow." Everyone had turned to look at her, expecting perhaps a sweet speech about love and family. Instead, she'd looked directly at me. "I've been thinking about the wedding party and the guest list, and I've realized that I want tomorrow to be perfect. Really perfect, which means I need everyone there to reflect the life Brandon and I are building together." She'd paused dramatically. "Sophia, I'm sorry, but I don't think you should come to the wedding tomorrow. It's nothing personal, but Brandon's family and our friends are all at a certain level professionally and socially, and I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable or out of place." The silence that followed was deafening. Our parents had looked mortified. Brandon's parents had exchanged glances that suggested they weren't entirely surprised, and I'd sat there processing the fact that my own sister had just uninvited me from her wedding because she was ashamed of what she thought my life looked like. That's when I'd excused myself, walked calmly to the ladies' room, and made a phone call to Marcus Rivera, my operations manager at Willowbrook Gardens. "Marcus," I'd said quietly, "I need you to cancel tomorrow's Morrison Keller wedding. Full refund, effective immediately." "Boss, that's going to be complicated," he'd replied. "Everything's set up, vendors are confirmed, staff is scheduled." "I understand the complications," I'd said. "Handle it professionally, but make it clear the cancellation is coming from ownership level. And Marcus, make sure they understand that Willowbrook Gardens will not be available for any future events involving the Keller or Morrison families." Now, 12 hours later, I sat in my home office, waiting for the chaos to begin. By my calculations, Marcus would be calling Melissa in about 6 hours to inform her that her wedding venue was no longer available. The vendors would start calling shortly after that. The panic would set in by mid-morning. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Melissa. "I hope you understand this is for the best. Maybe someday you'll have a wedding of your own, and you'll understand what I mean about wanting everything to be perfect." I set the phone down and looked out at my perfectly manicured grounds, illuminated by subtle landscape lighting that had cost more than most people's cars. Tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. The family that had spent years underestimating me was about to learn exactly who they'd been dismissing. And my sister, who had just kicked me out of her wedding for not being successful enough, was about to discover that her perfect venue belonged to the sister she'd deemed unworthy of attending her special day. Sometimes the best revenge is simply revealing the truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. But before dealing with the chaos that Marcus had undoubtedly unleashed, I wanted to understand exactly how my family had constructed their version of my life over the years. The narrative they'd built was so far from reality that it was almost impressive in its completeness. It had started during my senior year of college at Pemberton University. While my classmates were interviewing for corporate positions and talking about their post-graduation plans, I'd been quietly working on a business plan that would eventually become Grandview Events. My family saw my secretive behavior and late-night computer sessions as signs that I was struggling academically or having social problems. Sophia's always been a bit different, my mother would tell relatives who asked about my plans. She's very independent. Sometimes I worry she doesn't know how to ask for help when she needs it. The truth was, I'd been meeting with investors, studying market analytics, and developing relationships with vendors. But when I graduated and immediately started working 16-hour days, my family interpreted this as desperation rather than ambition. Melissa, who was 3 years older and had followed the traditional path, sorority president, marketing degree, immediate corporate job, engagement to her college boyfriend, had appointed herself as my life coach. She'd spent the last 6 years offering unsolicited advice about my career choices, my appearance, and my social life. The problem with Sophia, she'd explained to our cousin Rebecca at last year's Thanksgiving dinner, is that she doesn't understand networking. She thinks hard work is enough, but you need connections to get anywhere in business. She's stuck in this entry-level mindset. Entry-level mindset. This from a woman whose idea of a major business decision was choosing between two pre-approved marketing campaigns at her pharmaceutical company job. The family narrative had solidified around several key facts about my life. My job. They believed I worked for someone else's small event planning company, probably making around $35,000 a year. When I tried to explain that I owned my own business, they'd assumed I meant I was freelancing or running some kind of side hustle. It's sweet that Sophia calls herself an entrepreneur, Melissa had told Brandon's parents. We all have to start somewhere. My living situation, because I drove a practical car and dressed simply, they'd concluded I was struggling financially. My mother had actually offered to help me with rent payments twice, and Melissa had given me a gift card to Target for Christmas with a note about helping you get some nice things for your place. My social life. The fact that I didn't date publicly or bring men to family events had convinced them I was either too busy working to have a personal life or struggling with social anxiety. Poor Sophia, Eleanor Keller had whispered to her husband at the rehearsal dinner. 28 and still single. It must be so hard watching her sister get married. My financial status. This was the big one. They'd constructed an entire narrative about my financial struggles based on surface-level observations. I shopped at Target instead of Nordstrom. I brought homemade gifts to family occasions instead of expensive ones. I declined expensive group dinners and family vacations. To them, this looked like someone living paycheck to paycheck. The reality was that I'd developed these habits during my business's early years when every dollar needed to be reinvested, and they'd simply become my lifestyle. Why spend $200 on a dinner when $30 would be just as satisfying? Why buy a $500 purse when a $50 one served the same function? My family saw frugality and assumed poverty. Melissa had been particularly vocal about her concerns. I worry about Sophia's financial future, she'd told our parents 6 months ago. She's almost 30 and she has no savings, no investments, no real career trajectory. What happens when she gets older and can't keep up with the physical demands of event setup? Physical demands of event setup. She thought I was still personally moving tables and hanging decorations. The most frustrating part was how they'd rewritten history to fit their narrative. When I'd bought my house 3 years ago, I'd invited the family over for a housewarming party. Instead of recognizing it as a sign of success, They'd convinced themselves I was house-sitting for wealthy clients, or had gotten in over my head with a mortgage I couldn't afford. "It's a beautiful house," my father had said carefully, "but Sophia, are you sure you can handle the payments? These big places come with big expenses." When I'd explained that I'd paid cash, they'd exchanged looks that clearly communicated their belief that I was lying to save face. The idea that their struggling daughter had paid $1.2 million in cash for a custom home was simply incompatible with their established narrative. Even my appearance had been misinterpreted. I preferred classic, understated clothing, well-made, pieces in neutral colors that would last for years. To my family, this looked like someone trying to appear successful on a budget. Melissa had actually complimented me once on how put together I looked, considering your circumstances. The Brandon situation had made everything worse. From the moment Melissa started dating him, she'd been hyper-aware of how our family would appear to his wealthy parents. She'd coached our parents on conversation topics, suggested they avoid mentioning certain relatives, and specifically instructed everyone to keep discussions about my career vague. "Just say Sophia works in events," she'd told them. "Don't get into details." The Kellers move in circles where people have very specific ideas about success, and I don't want them to feel sorry for us. Because she was ashamed of having a sister who appeared to be unsuccessful. The final piece of their constructed narrative was the most painful. They'd decided I was bitter about their success. When I didn't gush over Melissa's engagement ring, or her promotion or her new condo, they interpreted my low-key responses as jealousy or resentment. "Sophia's having a hard time with my engagement," Melissa had confided to our mother. "I think it's bringing up feelings about her own situation. She's probably comparing her life to mine and feeling left behind." Left behind by someone whose biggest professional achievement was implementing a social media strategy that someone else had developed. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't bitter. I was busy. While they were having lengthy phone conversations about wedding flowers and venue decorations, I was negotiating acquisition deals and managing a company that employed 247 people across 12 properties. While they were discussing Brandon's career prospects, I was reviewing financial reports that showed my company's revenue had increased by 340% over the past 3 years. But the most telling part of their narrative was how they'd explained my absence from family events over the years. When I'd missed Christmas Eve dinner because I was managing a New Year's Eve event for 800 people, they'd assumed I was working retail during the holidays out of financial necessity. When I'd skipped Easter brunch because I was in Las Vegas coordinating a tech conference, they'd decided I was avoiding family gatherings because I was embarrassed about my life. Sophia's going through a difficult period had become my mother's standard explanation. She's working very hard to build something, but it's been challenging for her. Challenging. If only they knew that the challenge was deciding whether to acquire the boutique hotel chain in Colorado or focus on expanding my corporate event division into the Pacific Northwest. As I scrolled through the frantic messages on my phone, Marcus, confirming the cancellation, vendors asking for clarification, Melissa's increasingly hysterical texts, I realized that their carefully constructed narrative was about to collapse entirely. They'd built a story where I was the struggling younger sister who didn't fit into their successful world. In about 6 hours, they were going to discover that I wasn't just successful. I was more successful than any of them had ever imagined. And the sister who had kicked me out of her wedding for not being good enough was about to learn that her perfect venue belonged to the family disappointment she'd been pitying for years. By 7:30 a.m., my phone had become a symphony of chaos. I sat at my kitchen island, sipping my morning coffee from a mug that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, a small indulgence from a ceramics artist in Santa Fe whose work I'd discovered during a venue scouting trip. The irony wasn't lost on me that even my coffee mug told a story my family would never think to ask about. Marcus had executed the cancellation perfectly. His first call had gone to Melissa at 6:45 a.m., professionally delivered but devastating in its implications. Ms. Morrison, I'm calling from Willowbrook Gardens regarding tomorrow's wedding. Due to unforeseen ownership decisions, we need to cancel your event effective immediately. A full refund will be processed within 24 hours. The vendors started calling Melissa shortly after. Cascade Catering, confused about whether they should still prepare food for 150 guests. Harmony's Wedding Music, asking if they should show up to a venue that was no longer available. Enchanted Florals, wondering what to do with $3,000 worth of custom arrangements that had been designed specifically for Willowbrook's garden setting. Each conversation created more panic, more desperate phone calls, more realization that 24 hours before her wedding, Melissa had no venue and no backup plan. But what my family didn't know, what they'd never bothered to notice, was that the signs of my success had been hiding in plain sight for years. They were so committed to their narrative of my struggles that they'd overlooked details that should have raised questions. Take my car, for instance. Yes, it was a Honda Civic, but it was a top-of-the-line model with every available upgrade. The interior was genuine leather, the sound system was premium, and it had features that pushed the price into luxury territory. But because it wasn't a BMW or Mercedes, my family saw economy car and assumed financial limitation. The truth was, I'd chosen the Civic deliberately. It was reliable, efficient, and unremarkable, perfect for someone who didn't want to draw attention to her success. When I needed to impress clients, I used the company's fleet of luxury vehicles. For family dinners and grocery runs, the Civic was perfect camouflage. My clothing told a similar story to anyone paying attention. I wore simple, classic pieces, but they were from designers whose names commanded respect in certain circles. The black dress I'd worn to the rehearsal dinner was from a boutique in Milan that didn't even have a storefront. You had to know someone to access their collection. The understated jewelry was custom-made by an artisan in Switzerland who had a 2-year waiting list. But my family saw simple black dress and minimal jewelry without recognizing the quality or exclusivity. They were looking for obvious status symbols, flashy logos, recognizable brand names, conspicuous displays of wealth. My style was the opposite, expensive pieces that whispered rather than shouted. Even my gift-giving should have been a clue. For Melissa's birthday last year, I'd given her a weekend at a spa resort in Napa Valley. Not just any spa, the kind of place where celebrities went to disappear, where a 2-night stay cost more than most people's monthly rent. But because I'd presented it as a little getaway to help you relax, they'd assumed I'd found some kind of discount package. The spa weekend had included private yoga sessions, organic farm-to-table meals, and treatments using products made exclusively for the resort. Melissa had raved about the experience for months, posting photos on social media and telling everyone it was the most luxurious weekend of her life. Yet somehow, none of them connected that level of luxury with the financial resources required to arrange it. My Christmas gifts followed the same pattern. Last year, I'd given my parents a wine collection that included bottles from vineyards that didn't sell to the general public. The wine had to be purchased through special connections, and the total value was close to $5,000. But because I'd presented it in a simple wooden box with a handwritten note, they'd assumed it was thoughtfully chosen wine from local vineyards. They'd served one of the bottles at Easter dinner, completely unaware they were drinking wine that collectors would pay thousands to obtain. The technology in my house should have raised questions too. During the housewarming party, they'd admired my entertainment system without realizing they were looking at equipment that cost more than most people's cars. The sound system was installed by the same company that handled recording studios and high-end theaters. The smart home features were cutting-edge technology that wasn't even available to most consumers yet. But they'd focused on the house being too big for one person and worried about my ability to afford the utilities, completely missing the fact that someone struggling financially doesn't install $50,000 worth of audio-visual equipment. My work schedule was another overlooked clue. I traveled frequently, often internationally. But when I mentioned being in Paris or London or Los Angeles, they assumed it was personal travel funded by credit cards I couldn't afford. The idea that I might be traveling for business, the kind of high-level business that justified first-class flights and five-star hotels, never occurred to them. Sophia's always been a dreamer, my mother would say when I mentioned upcoming trips. I just hope she's not getting herself into debt trying to live beyond her means. The professional relationships in my life were equally misunderstood. When Governor Harrison's chief of staff called me during a family dinner, they assumed it was a wrong number. When the mayor of Millbrook Heights personally thanked me at a charity event, they thought it was a case of mistaken identity. When business magazines mentioned Grandview Events in their coverage of industry trends, they assumed it was a coincidence that a company shared my business name. The most telling oversight was their complete lack of curiosity about my actual work. They'd never asked to see my office, never inquired about my clients, never shown interest in the specific events I managed. If they had, they would have discovered that my little event planning company had coordinated weddings for tech billionaires, corporate retreats for Fortune 500 companies, and political fundraisers that attracted national attention. But asking those questions would have required abandoning their established narrative, and they were too invested in seeing me as the family member who needed help. Even my charity work had been misinterpreted. I served on the board of 3 nonprofit organizations and had donated significant amounts to various causes over the years. But when they saw my name in donor lists or event programs, they assumed it was token involvement, maybe volunteer work, to network for business connections. Last year, I'd quietly funded the renovation of the children's wing at Millbrook General Hospital. The project cost $200,000, and the hospital had named a family consultation room in my honor. When my parents saw the dedication plaque during a routine visit, they'd assumed it was recognition for volunteer work rather than a major financial contribution. The business contacts in my phone would have told the whole story. I had direct numbers for venue owners across the country, celebrity event planners, exclusive caterers, and luxury service providers. My phone buzzed regularly with calls from people whose names appeared in business magazines and society pages. But my family had trained themselves not to see these signs. They'd created a comfortable narrative where I was struggling but proud, working hard but not succeeding, trying to better myself but falling short. Acknowledging the evidence of my success would have meant admitting they'd been wrong about me for years. The most painful part was that I'd stopped trying to correct their assumptions years ago. Early in my business's growth, I'd attempted to share my successes with them. When I'd landed my first major corporate client, I'd called my mother excited to share the news. Her response had been, "That's nice, honey, but don't get your hopes up too high. These things have a way of falling through." When my business had been featured in Regional Business Monthly as one of the area's fastest-growing companies, I'd brought the magazine to a family dinner. Melissa had glanced at it and said, "It's sweet that they include small businesses in these things. It must be encouraging for people just starting out." After enough dismissive responses, I'd learned to keep my successes to myself. It was easier to let them maintain their assumptions than to constantly fight for recognition of my achievements. Now, as my phone continued to buzz with increasingly frantic messages from Melissa, I realized that all those overlooked clues were about to converge into an undeniable truth. The struggling sister they'd been pitying owned the venue where Melissa's perfect wedding was supposed to happen in 18 hours. And the family member they'd deemed not successful enough to attend the celebration was about to demonstrate exactly how much power comes with being consistently underestimated. By 9:15 a.m., my phone had become the command center for a full-scale family crisis management operation. What started as Melissa's individual panic had evolved into a coordinated family response that revealed just how systematically they'd been managing their perception of me for years. The first sign of organized opposition came through a group text that I wasn't included in, but which my cousin Rebecca accidentally forwarded to me instead of our mutual aunt. The message thread was titled, "Sophia Situation, Urgent," and contained 2 hours' worth of family members strategizing about how to handle what they were calling my breakdown. They'd decided that my absence from Melissa's wedding, combined with the venue's mysterious cancellation, meant I was having some kind of emotional crisis. The working theory, developed collectively by my mother, 2 aunts, and my grandmother, was that I'd finally snapped under the pressure of watching my successful sister get married while my own life remained stagnant. "This is clearly a cry for help," my Aunt Carol had written in the group chat. "Sophia's been struggling for years, and seeing Melissa's happiness has probably pushed her over the edge. We need to intervene before she does something really destructive." The family had appointed themselves as crisis counselors, each taking on specific roles in what they were treating as a mental health emergency. My mother was designated as the primary contact, who would handle gentle confrontation. My father was assigned to financial assessment, to determine if I needed monetary help to get through this difficult period. Melissa, despite being in the middle of her own wedding disaster, had been tasked with sister-to-sister emotional support once she'd dealt with her venue situation. What was remarkable was how quickly they'd organized this intervention. Within 3 hours of the venue cancellation, they'd created action items, assigned responsibilities, and developed talking points for approaching me. It was the kind of efficient coordination they'd never applied to actually understanding my life, but they deployed it seamlessly when they needed to manage what they saw as my public embarrassment of the family. My grandmother, who was 83 and typically stayed out of family drama, had been recruited as the wisdom voice who would help me understand that success isn't everything, and that I needed to find peace with my circumstances. The fact that my circumstances included owning 12 premium venues and employing nearly 250 people was, of course, not part of their assessment. The most telling part of their crisis response was how they'd immediately connected my absence from the wedding to the venue cancellation, but had drawn completely wrong conclusions about the relationship between these events. They'd decided that I'd learned about the venue cancellation somehow, maybe through my event planning contacts, and had spiraled into such despair about Melissa's misfortune that I'd declared myself unworthy to attend the wedding. "She probably thinks this is all her fault somehow," my Aunt Linda had contributed to the group chat. "You know how Sophia takes responsibility for things that aren't her problem. She's probably convinced herself that her bad luck is rubbing off on Melissa." Bad luck. They thought my absence and the venue cancellation were both symptoms of my personal failure, rather than cause and effect of my personal success. The coordination extended beyond emotional management into practical damage control. They'd divided up the task of calling venues across the tri-state area, trying to find a last-minute location for Melissa's wedding. Each family member had been assigned a geographic region and a list of contacts to pursue. What they didn't realize was that they were calling venues that were either owned by me or had professional relationships with Grandview Events. My cousin James had spent an hour on the phone with the events coordinator at Riverside Manor, not knowing he was talking to someone who reported directly to me. My Uncle David had left 3 voicemails at Crescent Hill Estate, unaware that I'd acquired the property 18 months ago. The conversations were exercises in frustration for my family members, who couldn't understand why premium venues were either completely booked or mysteriously unavailable for last-minute events. They'd attributed this to bad luck, poor planning, or the general difficulty of finding quality venues on short notice. "Everything good is booked solid," my father had reported to the group chat. "It's like there's some kind of conspiracy against us finding a decent place." Conspiracy, if only he knew. But the most organized aspect of their response was the narrative they'd constructed about my motivations. They'd collectively decided that my actions were driven by jealousy, mental instability, and resentment about my failed life. This wasn't just one person's opinion. This was a family consensus that had been reached through group discussion and mutual reinforcement. The evidence they'd assembled for my psychological breakdown was comprehensive and completely wrong. My simple lifestyle became proof of depression. My absence from recent family events became evidence of social withdrawal. My lack of serious romantic relationships became a sign of emotional dysfunction. My career focus became workaholism born of desperation. They'd even recruited outside validation for their assessment. Brandon's mother, Eleanor, had apparently been consulted about my behavior at the rehearsal dinner. Her professional opinion, she'd taken 2 psychology classes in college 40 years ago, was that I displayed classic signs of someone struggling with inadequacy issues. She was very quiet during dinner, Eleanor had reportedly told my mother, almost withdrawn. And when we discussed successful people we knew, she got this look on her face like she was calculating how far behind she was. It was actually quite sad. The look on my face had been me calculating whether I should mention that I'd coordinated events for 3 of the successful people they'd name-dropped, but I'd decided against it. Apparently, my restraint had been interpreted as despair. The family's coordination extended to managing the broader social implications of both my absence and the venue crisis. They'd developed a unified story for extended family, friends, and acquaintances that positioned both events as unfortunate but unrelated coincidences. The official narrative was that I was going through a difficult period and had made the difficult decision not to attend the wedding to avoid bringing negative energy to Melissa's special day. The venue cancellation was being attributed to last-minute complications that were completely unrelated to any family issues. Several family members had already begun making calls to relatives who were expected to attend the wedding, preparing them for the changes and ensuring everyone understood the approved version of events. My cousin Rebecca had been tasked with managing social media, making sure that any posts about the wedding situation didn't reflect poorly on the family's ability to handle crisis. What was most revealing was how quickly they'd mobilized this level of organization to protect their reputation, while doing absolutely nothing to understand what was actually happening. They'd spent more time in 3 hours developing crisis management strategies than they'd spent in 3 years asking about my actual career. The efficiency of their response showed that they were capable of coordination and strategic thinking when it mattered to them. They could assign roles, develop talking points, and execute complex plans when they needed to manage their public image. But they'd never applied that same level of attention to understanding why their assumptions about my life might be wrong. By 10:30 a.m., their crisis management operation was in full swing. Phone calls were being made, stories were being coordinated, and intervention strategies were being deployed. They'd created a comprehensive response to what they saw as my breakdown, complete with emotional support, financial assistance, and reputation management. What they hadn't considered was the possibility that I wasn't having a breakdown at all, that the venue cancellation wasn't random bad luck, that my absence from the wedding wasn't self-imposed exile born of inadequacy. They were about to discover that their carefully coordinated response to my supposed crisis was actually a response to my carefully orchestrated demonstration of power. The family members who had organized themselves to manage my emotional collapse were about to learn that they'd been managing the wrong crisis entirely. The intervention they were planning would become a revelation they weren't prepared for, and the sister they were trying to save from her own destructive behavior was about to show them exactly how much destruction someone can cause when they own the venues, know the vendors, and control the entire infrastructure of the industry. Their family was desperately trying to navigate. By noon, the pressure had reached a boiling point that I could feel through my phone even from 40 miles away. What had started as a venue crisis had escalated into a full family emergency, with emotions running so high that rational thinking had completely abandoned the situation. Melissa's messages had evolved from confusion to panic to something approaching hysteria. Her latest text, sent at 11:47 a.m., contained 17 question marks and was written entirely in capital letters. "Sophia, where are you? We need to talk right now. This is an emergency." But it wasn't just Melissa anymore. The entire family communication network had shifted into crisis mode. and I was receiving increasingly frantic calls and messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. The coordination they'd demonstrated earlier was breaking down under the pressure of failed venue searches and mounting desperation. My mother's voicemails had progressed from concern to pleading to something that bordered on demanding. Her 11:30 a.m. message was particularly revealing. "Sophia, honey, I know you're going through something difficult right now, but this is bigger than just you. Melissa needs our family to come together. Whatever's happening with you personally, we can deal with it later. Right now, we need you to put your issues aside and help us save your sister's wedding." Put my issues aside. The assumption that my absence was about personal problems rather than personal power was so deeply embedded that even a crisis couldn't shake it loose. The venue search had become increasingly desperate as the morning progressed. What my family didn't understand was that premium venues capable of hosting 150 guests on less than 24 hours' notice essentially didn't exist. The few places that might theoretically be available weren't the kind of locations where people wanted to celebrate their dream weddings. My cousin James had found a banquet hall at a mid-tier hotel that could accommodate the guest count, but the space was designed for corporate conferences, not romantic celebrations. The walls were beige, the lighting was fluorescent, and the garden view looked out onto a parking lot. But desperation was making previously unacceptable options seem reasonable. "It's not ideal," James had reported to the family group chat, "but we could make it work. Maybe rent some plants to put around the room, get better lighting, hang some fabric on the walls. If we all pitch in, we could transform it. Transform it from a sterile conference room into a space worthy of a wedding in less than 18 hours. The logistics alone were impossible, but panic was overriding practical considerations. My Aunt Carol had located a country club that claimed to have availability, but further investigation revealed that their availability was actually their cafeteria space during lunch hours. The wedding would have to end by 4 p.m. to make room for the dinner crowd, and guests would be eating off plastic plates because the regular dishes were being used for the restaurant service. "We could call it a lunch reception," Carol had suggested with forced optimism. "Some of the most elegant. Weddings are daytime events. Elegant. A cafeteria with plastic plates and a hard end time was being reimagined as elegant because they'd run out of actual options." The most telling sign of their desperation was Brandon's father's suggestion that they consider having the ceremony at their house. Richard Keller, who had spent months bragging about exclusive venues and high-end events, was now proposing that his son's wedding reception be held in their suburban backyard. "We could rent a tent," he'd offered during a conference call that I wasn't part of but heard about through Rebecca. "Set up some tables, hire a DJ instead of the band. It wouldn't be what we originally planned, but family is what matters, right? From exclusive venue to backyard tent in 12 hours. The social implications alone should have horrified people who'd spent the entire engagement period focused on appearances and status. But the pressure wasn't just about logistics, it was about blame. As the venue search proved increasingly futile, family members were looking for someone to hold responsible for the disaster, and since they'd already established that I was having some kind of breakdown, I was becoming the convenient target for their frustration. My Uncle David had left me a voicemail that was barely disguised anger. "Sophia, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but your sister's wedding is falling apart, and you're nowhere to be found. This is not the time for whatever drama you've got going on. Call me back immediately. Game. Drama." They were so invested in their narrative of my inadequacy that they couldn't conceive of any scenario where I might have actual power over the situation. The pressure was also building around the vendors, who were caught in an impossible situation. The caterer had 150 meals prepared for an event that no longer had a location. The florist had created custom arrangements designed specifically for Willowbrook Gardens architecture and landscaping. The photographer had scouted the venue, planned shots, and prepared for specific lighting conditions. Each vendor was asking the same questions. Where was the new venue? What were the backup plans? Would they still be needed? And most importantly, who was going to take responsibility for the additional costs created by last-minute changes? Marcus, following my instructions to handle everything professionally, had provided the vendor contact information to the family so they could coordinate directly. But what he hadn't told them, what they were about to discover, was that most of their wedding vendors were companies that had exclusive or preferred partnerships with Grandview Events properties. Cascade Catering, for instance, had built their reputation largely on events held at my venues. Their pricing, their menus, and their service style were all optimized for the kind of high-end locations I owned. Trying to deliver the same level of service in a hotel conference room or backyard tent would be like asking an orchestra to perform in a phone booth. The mounting pressure was creating cracks in the family's united front. Stress was revealing underlying tensions that had been hidden beneath the coordinated crisis response. Melissa had started blaming our parents for not doing enough to find alternatives. Our parents were frustrated with Brandon's family for not having better connections. The extended family was questioning why they'd been pulled into a crisis that wasn't really their responsibility. By 12:30 p.m., the desperation had reached the point where they were considering postponing the wedding entirely. This was the nuclear option that no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone was starting to think about. The logistics were becoming impossible, the costs were spiraling out of control, and the stress was damaging relationships. But postponement meant admitting defeat. It meant calling 150 guests less than 24 hours before the ceremony to tell them the wedding was canceled. It meant dealing with hotels, flights, and travel arrangements that couldn't be changed. It meant social embarrassment on a scale that would be talked about for years. The pressure had also revealed how much their social standing mattered to them. This wasn't just about Melissa's happiness. It was about family reputation, social positioning, and the way they'd be perceived by Brandon's wealthy family and their broader social circle. Eleanor Keller had made this clear in a phone conversation with my mother that Rebecca had overheard and reported back to me. "Patricia, I understand this is a difficult situation, but Richard and I are concerned about how this reflects on both families. We have guests flying in from across the country, some very prominent people. If we can't provide them with an appropriate celebration," the threat was implicit but clear. If the wedding became a social embarrassment, it would damage relationships that extended far beyond the immediate family. As 1 p.m. approached, the pressure was building toward an inevitable breaking point. The family's coordinated response was fragmenting under stress. The venue search had revealed how limited their options actually were. The vendor complications were multiplying by the hour. And the social implications were becoming impossible to ignore. They were about to discover that all of their crisis management skills, all of their coordination, and all of their assumptions about who held power in this situation were completely wrong. The pressure they were feeling wasn't random bad luck or coincidental timing. It was the carefully orchestrated result of underestimating someone who owned the very industry they were desperately trying to navigate. At 1:47 p.m., exactly 18 hours and 13 minutes before Melissa's wedding was scheduled to begin, my family's desperation reached its breaking point. I was in my home office, reviewing quarterly reports from my Seattle properties, when my phone rang with a conference call that would change everything. The caller ID showed my mother's number, but when I answered, I could hear multiple voices in the background. They'd gathered at my parents' house, I could tell from the echo in their formal dining room, and had apparently decided that a coordinated intervention was the only way to break through what they saw as my stubborn refusal to help in the family. "Crisis. Sophia?" My mother's voice came through with forced calm. "We have you on speakerphone. We're all here. Me, your father, Melissa, Brandon, his parents, Aunt Carol, Uncle David, and Grandmother Morrison. We need to have a serious conversation about what's happening. All here." They'd assembled a tribunal of 9 people to confront me about my supposed breakdown. The formality of it was staggering. like a corporate board meeting designed to address an employee's performance issues. "We're very concerned about you," my father added, his voice carrying that careful tone people use when they think they're talking to someone on the edge of a breakdown. "This isn't like you, sweetheart. Even when you've had difficulties before, you've always been there for family." Difficulties before? They'd rewritten every career milestone, every business success, every strategic decision as a difficulty that I'd somehow overcome through family support. But it was Melissa who delivered the attack that revealed just how deeply their resentment had been building beneath the surface concern. Her voice was tight with stress, exhaustion, and barely contained anger. "Sophia, I need you to stop hiding and start explaining. My wedding is in 18 hours, and I have no venue, no backup plan, and vendors who can't do their jobs because everything was designed for a place that suddenly doesn't want our business. Meanwhile, you disappear right after telling me not to come to the wedding, and now you won't even answer our calls properly." She paused, and I could hear her breathing heavily, working up to something bigger. "I've been thinking about this all morning, and the timing is just too convenient. You get uninvited from the wedding and suddenly our venue cancels? You're in event planning. You have connections, you hear things. Did you know this was going to happen? Did you know when you left the rehearsal dinner that our wedding was going to fall apart?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. She was suggesting that I'd somehow engineered or known about the venue cancellation and had chosen not to warn them. In her mind, I was either incompetent enough to let my family walk into disaster or malicious enough to allow it to happen, out of spite. "Because if you knew," Melissa continued, her voice rising, "if you had any advance warning that Willowbrook Gardens was going to cancel on us and you said nothing, that's not just letting your family down. That's sabotage." Sabotage. The word hit like a physical blow. Not because it was untrue, but because it revealed how quickly they'd moved from seeing me as a victim of circumstance to seeing me as an active threat to their happiness. Brandon's voice joined the attack, and his tone carried the kind of controlled anger that suggested he'd been holding back his real feelings about me for months. "Sophia, I don't know you very well, but I know what I've observed. You've been resistant to this wedding from the beginning. You've been distant, unengaged, almost hostile to the whole process. And now, when Melissa needs her family the most, you're playing games with people's lives." Playing games. The same phrase my uncle had used earlier. They'd collectively decided that my behavior was some kind of manipulation or attention-seeking rather than a response to their treatment of me. But it was Eleanor Keller who delivered, the most devastating part of the attack, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to and obeyed. "Sophia, I'm going to be very direct with you because I think this situation requires honesty. I've been watching your behavior throughout this engagement period, and I've seen patterns that concern me greatly." She paused for effect, clearly comfortable with commanding the attention of a room full of people. "You've been resentful of your sister's success, uncomfortable with her happiness, and resistant to celebrating her achievements. That's understandable. It can be difficult when a sibling surpasses us in life, but allowing those feelings to interfere with family obligations crosses a line. Surpasses us in life. The phrase was delivered with such casual certainty that it took my breath away. This woman who barely knew me had assessed my entire existence and found it wanting compared to her son's fiancé. "What's happening now?" Eleanor continued. "Appears to be a pattern of self-destructive behavior that's affecting innocent people. Whether you knew about the venue cancellation or not, your response to this crisis has been to disappear when your family needs you most. That's not just immature, it's selfish. Selfish, immature, self-destructive." Each word was chosen to cut, delivered by someone who had no idea she was talking to a person who employed more people than her husband's entire business operation. But it was my grandmother's voice that delivered the final blow, the one that revealed just how completely they'd constructed their narrative of my failures. "Sophie, dear," she said, using the childhood nickname that no one had called me in 15 years. I've lived long enough to see patterns in families. I've watched young people struggle with feeling left behind, feeling like they can't measure, up to siblings who seem to have everything figured out. She paused, and I could picture her settling back in her chair, preparing to deliver what she thought was wisdom born of experience. But, sweetheart, at some point, you have to accept responsibility for your own life and stop blaming others for your circumstances. Your sister has worked hard to build something beautiful with Brandon. She deserves to have her family celebrate that achievement, not undermine it because you're struggling with your own situation. Your own situation. As if my situation was something to be pitied rather than respected, managed rather than celebrated. We love you, Grandmother continued. But love sometimes means telling people difficult truths. And the truth is that your behavior over the past 24 hours has been unacceptable. You're hurting people who care about you, and you're damaging relationships that should matter more than whatever personal crisis you're going through. The silence that followed was deafening. 9 people were waiting for my response to their coordinated attack, their collective assessment of my character, their unified demand that I explain myself to their satisfaction. They'd gathered like a jury to deliver their verdict. I was the problem. My absence was selfishness. My silence was manipulation. My behavior was unacceptable. And my life, as they understood it, was a series of failures that I was now allowing to damage the people who had been patient with my inadequacies for too long. What they didn't realize was that they'd just publicly attacked someone who owned the entire infrastructure they were desperately trying to navigate. They'd accused someone who controlled their vendors, their backup options, and their ability to salvage any part of this situation. They'd organized themselves into a tribunal to judge my failures, not knowing they were about to discover that the person they were condemning held more power over their crisis than they'd ever imagined. The attack was complete. The accusations had been made. The judgments had been delivered. Now it was time for them to learn exactly who they'd been talking to. The silence stretched for exactly 17 seconds after my grandmother finished her character assassination. I counted them, watching the digital clock on my computer screen while 9 people waited for me to break down, apologize, or defend myself against their coordinated attack. Instead, I did something they weren't expecting. I remained completely calm. I appreciate everyone taking the time to share their perspectives, I said, my voice steady and professional. Before I respond to your concerns, I need to make a few phone calls to clarify some details about the venue situation. Would you mind holding for just a moment? The request was so reasonable, so unexpectedly composed, that they agreed without thinking. I could hear confused murmurs in the background as I put them on hold, but what they didn't realize was that I'd just shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. They'd expected emotional defensiveness. They'd prepared for tears, anger, or desperate explanations. My calm professionalism was completely outside their script for dealing with my supposed breakdown. While they waited, I made the first of several strategic calls that would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. Marcus, I said when my operations manager answered, I need you to call the Morrison Keller wedding party directly. Use the family contact number I'm about to send you. Sure, boss. What's the message? Tell them that the ownership of Willowbrook Gardens would like to discuss the cancellation situation directly with the family. Schedule a conference call for 3 p.m. today. And Marcus, use the formal protocol. Full corporate introduction, official titles, the works. Got it. Anything else? Yes. Contact our legal team and have them prepare documentation showing the full ownership structure of all Grandview properties. I want a complete portfolio summary ready for immediate transmission. And reach out to Jennifer Walsh. We may need corporate representation for this call. Understood. Should I coordinate with the other properties as well? This was the key question. Marcus was asking whether I wanted to involve the rest of my business empire in whatever was about to happen. It was the difference between revealing that I owned one venue and revealing that I controlled an entire industry network that my family had been desperately trying to navigate for the past 6 hours. Yes, I said. Full disclosure protocol. I want them to understand the complete scope of the situation. After ending that call, I placed 3 more strategic calls that would systematically dismantle every assumption my family had made about their crisis and my role in it. The first was to Jennifer Walsh, the corporate attorney who had handled all of my major acquisitions over the past 4 years. Jennifer was the kind of lawyer who charged $800 an hour and earned every penny through precision, preparation, and an intimidating command of corporate law. Jennifer, I need you on a conference call at 3 p.m. today. Family situation that requires legal clarity about business ownership and operational authority. Personal or professional matter? She asked. Both. My family is dealing with a venue cancellation that they don't realize is connected to my business operations. They've made some accusations that need to be addressed with complete legal clarity. I see. Do you need documentation of corporate structure, financial standing, or operational control? All of the above. I want there to be no ambiguity about who owns what and who makes decisions about business operations. The second call was to Robert Chen, the CEO of Chen Digital Solutions, and one of my most significant corporate clients. Robert's company had held their annual executive retreat at 3 of my properties over the past 2 years, and his testimonial had been instrumental in landing several other high-profile corporate accounts. Robert, I need a professional favor. Would you be available for a brief conference call at 3 p.m. today to provide a client perspective on Grandview Events operations? Of course. Is this for a reference or something more formal? Family situation where my professional reputation and business capabilities are being questioned. I need someone with your corporate credentials to provide context about the level of events we coordinate. Understood. Should I mention the international conferences, the Fortune 500 accounts, or keep it general? Be comprehensive. I need them to understand the actual scale of what we do. The third call was to Amanda Richardson, the senior events coordinator, who had managed logistics for Governor Harrison's daughter's wedding 6 months ago. That event had been featured in 3 national magazines and had established Grandview Events as the premier choice for high-profile political celebrations. Amanda, I need you on a call at 3 p.m. to discuss the Harrison wedding from a professional operations perspective. Family situation requiring clarity about our client base and event scope. The political connections or the media coverage angle? Both. I need them to understand that we don't just coordinate local events. After completing these calls, I returned to the conference line where my family had been waiting, their voices showing increasing agitation about the delay. Sorry to keep you waiting, I said, maintaining the same calm tone. I've been arranging some clarification about the venue situation that I think will help everyone understand what's actually happening. Sophia, my mother's voice carried a edge of impatience. We don't need clarification about venues. We need you to take responsibility for your behavior and help us figure out how to save Melissa's wedding. I understand your perspective, Mom, but I think there are some facts about the situation that will change how everyone sees what's been happening. I've arranged for a conference call at 3 p.m. that will provide complete transparency about the venue cancellation and the options available to resolve it. What kind of conference call? Brandon's voice was suspicious now. A call with the actual decision-makers involved in the venue cancellation. The people who have the authority to explain exactly what happened and what alternatives might be possible. I could hear them conferring in the background, probably trying to figure out how I'd manage to get access to venue management on such short notice. They were attributing it to my event planning connections, without realizing that I was the venue management. Fine, Melissa said, exhaustion clear in her voice. If you think talking to the venue people will help, we'll do the call. But Sophia, this better not be another delay tactic. My wedding is in 16 hours. I understand the timing pressure, I replied. That's exactly why I think this call will be productive. The people you'll be speaking with have the authority to make decisions that can resolve this situation quickly. What they didn't realize was that I'd just transformed their attempted intervention into my own strategic operation. Instead of defending myself against their accusations, I'd created a forum where the truth would be revealed with professional authority and legal backing. They thought they'd cornered me into explaining my failures. Instead, I'd arranged for them to discover exactly who they'd been attacking. The 3 p.m. call would include a corporate attorney, a Fortune 500 CEO, a senior political event coordinator, and the operations manager of a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire. 9 family members who thought they were dealing with a struggling event planner were about to find themselves in a conference room with the corporate infrastructure of an industry leader. "I'll send everyone the call-in information," I said, "and I'd suggest that you all remain on the line together. The information that's going to be shared will affect the entire family." "What kind of information?" Eleanor's voice carried the first hint that maybe this wasn't going according to their plan. The kind that explains exactly why Willowbrook Gardens canceled your event, who made that decision, and what authority they had to make it. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't the pause of people waiting for an explanation. This was the pause of people beginning to realize that they might not understand the situation as well as they thought they did. In 90 minutes, their carefully constructed narrative about my failures was going to collide with the documented reality of my success. Their assumptions about my powerlessness were about to meet my actual control over their entire crisis. They'd assembled a tribunal to judge my inadequacies. Instead, they were about to attend a corporate presentation about their complete misunderstanding of who they'd been dealing with all along. At exactly 3 p.m., I dialed into the conference call that would destroy every assumption my family had built about my life over the past 6 years. The timing was perfect. 15 hours before Melissa's wedding was supposed to begin, just enough time for the full implications to sink in. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said as the call connected. "Thank you all for joining us on short notice. I have my family on the line, along with several business associates who can provide clarity about the venue situation." I could hear shuffling and whispered conversations from my family's end as they tried to position themselves around the speakerphone in my parents' dining room. They were expecting to talk to a venue manager, maybe an events coordinator who could explain the cancellation and possibly offer alternatives. They weren't prepared for what came next. "Let me begin with introductions," I continued, maintaining the professional tone that had been unsettling them all afternoon. "First, we have Marcus Rivera, Operations Manager for Grandview Events and Hospitality." Marcus's voice came through, with crisp corporate authority. "Good afternoon. I'm the Operations Manager responsible for coordinating all venue activities across our 12-property portfolio in the tri-state area." 12 properties. I heard someone, I think it was my father, whisper "what?" in the background. We also have Jennifer Walsh, senior partner at Morrison & Associates, serving as corporate counsel for Grandview Events. Jennifer's introduction was delivered with the kind of professional precision that made Fortune 500 executives nervous. "Good afternoon. I handle all legal matters for Grandview Events, including acquisitions, contracts, and corporate governance. I have the complete documentation of yesterday's venue cancellation and the authority behind it. Additionally," I continued, "we're joined by Robert Chen, CEO of Chen Digital Solutions, who can speak to our corporate event capabilities." Robert's voice carried the easy confidence of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations. "Good afternoon. Chen Digital has used Grandview Events exclusively for our corporate functions for the past 2 years, including our annual executive retreat for 300 senior managers and our international client summit last month." The silence from my family's end was becoming noticeable. This wasn't sounding like a conversation with a small local venue that had made a mistake. "And finally," I said, "Amanda Richardson, Senior Events Coordinator, who manages our high-profile political and celebrity events." Amanda's introduction was the one that would truly shock them. Good afternoon. I coordinate events for Grandview that require security clearances and media management. Most recently, I managed logistics for Governor Harrison's daughter's wedding, which was featured in Architectural Digest and Town and Country. Governor Harrison, the same governor whose chief of staff had called me during a family dinner. The call they'd assumed was a wrong number. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then I heard my mother's voice, small and confused. I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake. We're calling about Willowbrook Gardens canceling our daughter's wedding. We're not. We don't need corporate event services. Jennifer's response was legally precise and devastating. Mrs. Morrison, there's no mistake. Willowbrook Gardens is owned by Grandview Events and Hospitality. The cancellation was authorized at the ownership level by the company's founder and CEO. The founder and CEO? Brandon's voice cracked slightly. This was my moment. 6 years of hidden success, 6 years of underestimation, 6 years of watching my family pity me while I built an empire they couldn't even comprehend. All of it had led to this single moment of revelation. That would be me, I said quietly. I'm Sophia Hartwell, founder and CEO of Grandview Events and Hospitality. I own Willowbrook Gardens, along with 11 other premium venues across the tri-state area. I personally authorized the cancellation of your wedding. The explosion of voices from their end was immediate and chaotic. I heard Melissa scream, my mother gasp, and several people talking at once in voices too overlapping to distinguish. But underneath it all, I heard Eleanor Keller's voice, sharp with shock. That's impossible! Marcus stepped in to provide supporting details while my family processed the initial shock. For context, Grandview Events was founded 6 years ago and has grown to employ 247 people across our properties. Our annual revenue last year was $23.7 million, with projected growth to $31 million this year. $31 million. While they'd been worrying about my ability to pay rent, I'd been running a business that generated more revenue than most small towns. Robert Chen added the client perspective that would shatter their assumptions about my professional standing. I should mention that Grandview Events coordinates events for 17 Fortune 500 companies, including several that require international logistics and security protocols. Sophia personally managed our Beijing office opening last year, coordinating with both American and Chinese government officials. Beijing. International government coordination. While they'd assumed I was struggling with small local events, I'd been managing corporate functions that required diplomatic clearances, but it was Amanda's addition that truly drove home the scope of what they'd been dismissing. The governor's daughter's wedding had 400 guests, including 3 senators, 2 federal judges, and delegations from 4 countries. The security briefing alone took 2 weeks. Sophia coordinated every detail, personally, while managing simultaneous events at 3 other properties. The silence returned, but this time it was the silence of people whose entire understanding of reality had just collapsed. Everything they'd believed, every assumption they'd made, every pitying comment and condescending suggestion, all of it, was being recontextualized in real time. Jennifer provided the legal framework that made it all undeniably official. I can confirm that Ms. Hartwell has full legal authority over all Grandview properties, including the right to cancel events at her discretion. The Willowbrook Gardens cancellation was executed according to standard corporate protocols. Standard corporate protocols, my grandmother repeated faintly, probably remembering her lecture about accepting responsibility for my failures. Now, I said, taking control of the call again, let's address the specific situation with Melissa's wedding. The cancellation was not arbitrary. It was a direct response to being informed that I was no longer welcome at the event. My voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. When a family member tells me I don't fit the aesthetic they're going for, when they suggest that my presence would make people uncomfortable, when they decide that my professional and social standing isn't appropriate for their celebration, I make business decisions accordingly. The weight of their words at the rehearsal dinner was hitting them now. Every dismissive comment, every assumption about my inadequacy, every decision to exclude me because I wasn't successful enough, all of it was being revealed as attacks on someone who controlled exactly what they needed most. I own the venue you wanted for your dream wedding, I continued. I have exclusive relationships with the vendors you're trying to coordinate with. I have connections to the alternative venues you've been desperately calling. When you decided I wasn't good enough to attend your wedding, you were excluding the person who controlled your entire celebration. Brandon's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. Sophia, we had no idea. No, I replied. You didn't. Because in 6 years, none of you ever asked. You were so committed to your assumptions about my failures that you never noticed the signs of my success. You saw what you wanted to see and ignored everything that contradicted your narrative. Marcus added one final detail that would complete their understanding of just how thoroughly they'd misunderstood the situation. For additional context, Rosewood Estate, the venue the Keller family originally wanted but couldn't book, is also owned by Grandview Events. It was unavailable because Ms. Hartwell maintains an exclusive booking policy for that property. Rosewood Estate, the venue Eleanor had described as so exclusive that they'd been turned away, the venue that was supposedly above their social level. I'd owned it all along. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was the sound of an entire family's worldview collapsing. The sister they'd pitied controlled the industry they were desperately trying to navigate. The family member they'd excluded for not being successful enough was more successful than any of them had ever imagined. And the woman they'd accused of sabotaging the wedding had, in fact, sabotaged the wedding, not out of breakdown or jealousy, but from a position of power they'd never suspected she possessed. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute after the revelation settled over the conference call. I could hear breathing, the occasional whispered word, and what sounded like someone crying softly in the background, probably Melissa, finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd lost through her own actions. When I spoke again, my voice carried none of the anger or vindication that my family might have expected. Instead, I delivered what I'd been preparing for years, a response that demonstrated exactly who I'd become during the time they'd been dismissing me. I want to thank my colleagues for providing that context, I began, because I think it's important that everyone understands the full scope of what's been happening over the past 24 hours. But before we discuss potential solutions, I'd like to address some of the concerns that were raised during our earlier conversation. I paused, giving them time to process that I was about to systematically respond to every accusation they'd made during their coordinated attack. First, the suggestion that my behavior has been driven by jealousy or resentment about Melissa's success. I want to be very clear about something. I'm genuinely happy about Melissa's engagement to Brandon. I've never had any personal feelings about their relationship except hope for their happiness together. My tone remained measured, professional, but there was an unmistakable authority in it now. However, I do have strong feelings about being told that my presence at their wedding would make people uncomfortable because of my perceived lack of success. I have strong feelings about being excluded from family celebrations because I don't fit the aesthetic that the bride is trying to achieve. I could hear shuffling from their end, probably people looking at each other with growing awareness of how their words at the rehearsal dinner had sounded to someone who'd just revealed themselves as more successful than anyone in that room. When Eleanor mentioned that she and Richard were concerned about guests feeling uncomfortable around someone who wasn't at their level professionally and socially, she was expressing concern about a Fortune 500 executive and multi-million-dollar business owner attending a pharmaceutical sales representative's wedding. The words hung in the air with devastating precision. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply stating facts that recontextualized their entire social hierarchy. Second, The accusation that I've been resistant to this wedding and unengaged with the process. You're absolutely right. I have been distant from the wedding planning, but not because I disapproved of the marriage. I've been distant because every conversation about the wedding included comments about my financial situation, my career prospects, or my social standing that were based on completely incorrect assumptions. I'd been keeping track of these moments for months, and now I could address them with the authority of someone who'd just proven that every assumption had been wrong. When Uncle David suggested that I might want to help with behind-the-scenes work because my experience was limited to small-scale stuff, he was offering someone who coordinates international corporate events the opportunity to help with local vendor management. When Grandmother Morrison advised me about accepting responsibility for my circumstances and not blaming others for my situation, she was giving life advice to someone whose business decisions affect nearly 250 employees across 3 states. Each statement was delivered without malice, but with the kind of factual precision that made the condescension impossible to ignore or explain away. Third, the suggestion that I'm having some kind of breakdown or emotional crisis that's affecting my judgment. I want to address this directly because it reveals something important about how this family processes information that doesn't fit established narratives. This was the part I'd been most looking forward to because it addressed the fundamental issue that had allowed this situation to develop in the first place. For 6 years, I've been building a business empire while this family has been constructing explanations for why I seem to be struggling. Every sign of my success was reinterpreted as evidence of my problems. Every strategic decision was seen as a failure to make better choices. I paused to let that sink in. When I paid cash for my house, you assumed I was financially overextended. When I traveled internationally for business, you assumed I was accumulating debt for personal travel. When I gave expensive gifts, you assumed I'd found discount packages. When I worked long hours, you assumed I was desperate rather than building something significant. The pattern was so clear now that even they couldn't deny it. The breakdown you've been concerned about is actually the opposite. It's been a breakthrough. It's been 6 years of strategic growth, careful investment, and deliberate business development that has resulted in exactly the kind of success that this family claims to value. Now came the part where I would demonstrate the difference between having power and abusing it. Which brings us to the current situation and what happens next. You've asked me to take responsibility for my behavior, and I want to do exactly that. I could feel their attention sharpening, probably hoping I was about to apologize and fix everything. I take full responsibility for authorizing the venue cancellation. It was a business decision made by someone who was told she didn't belong at a family celebration because of her perceived lack of success. When you exclude someone from your wedding because they don't meet your social standards, you shouldn't be surprised when that person makes business decisions accordingly. The responsibility I was taking wasn't the kind they'd been hoping for. Also, take responsibility for not correcting your assumptions about my life earlier. I allowed you to maintain beliefs about my situation that were completely incorrect, and that was a mistake. It prevented you from understanding who you were actually dealing with when you made decisions about family inclusion. However, I continued, and this was where they would learn the difference between admission and capitulation. I don't take responsibility for your decision to exclude me from Melissa's wedding, or for the consequences of that decision. My voice remained calm, but the steel underneath was unmistakable now. When you decide that someone doesn't deserve to celebrate with your family, you're making a choice about relationships and priorities. When that someone turns out to control the infrastructure you need for your celebration, the consequences of your choice become more significant than you anticipated. The silence from their end was complete now. They were beginning to understand that this wasn't going to end with me apologizing and fixing their problems. So here's what I'm prepared to offer, because despite everything that's happened, I still care about this family, and I still want Melissa's wedding to be beautiful. Hope crept into the silence. They thought I was about to save them. I will make Rosewood Estate available for the wedding. It's our most exclusive property, the one Eleanor originally wanted but couldn't access. It can accommodate your guest count, and it's significantly more elegant than Willowbrook Gardens. I could hear excited whispers starting in the background. Our staff will coordinate with all of your vendors to ensure seamless service. We'll provide upgraded amenities at no additional cost, including premium florals, enhanced catering options, and luxury transportation for the wedding party. The excitement was building on their end. They thought I was giving them a fairy tale ending. However, I said, and the word cut through their growing relief like ice. This offer comes with one non-negotiable condition. The silence returned, tense with anticipation. I won't attend the wedding, not because I'm not invited, but because I'm choosing not to attend. I will not celebrate with a family that has spent 6 years pitying me for failures that didn't exist, while ignoring success that exceeded anything any of you have achieved. The offer was perfect in its justice. They would get their dream wedding, more beautiful than they'd originally planned, provided by the sister they'd deemed unworthy to attend it. The choice is yours, I concluded. You can have the most elegant wedding venue in the tri-state area, coordinated by the most successful event planning company in the region, hosted by someone who won't be there to make anyone uncomfortable with her presence. I paused for one final moment. Think it over, and let Marcus know your decision by 5 p.m. The venue will be ready either way. The conference call ended at 3:47 p.m., and by 4:15 p.m., my phone had received 32 individual calls, 17 text messages, and 4 voicemails from various family members trying to process what they'd just learned. I answered none of them. Instead, I sat in my office, reviewing the financial reports from my Portland properties while my family grappled with the complete collapse of their understanding of reality. The first crack in their united front came through a text from my cousin, Rebecca, at 4:23 p.m. Sophia, I need you to know that I never agreed with how they talked about you. I always thought there was more to your story. I'm sorry it took this long for the truth to come out. Rebecca had been the family member most likely to ask actual questions about my work over the years, but even she had accepted the general narrative that I was struggling with career development. Her message revealed that at least one person had harbored doubts about their collective assessment of my situation. The second crack came from my father at 4:31 p.m., in a voicemail that I could hear was recorded away from the others. Sweetheart, I don't even know what to say. Your mother and I are sitting here trying to understand how we got everything so wrong. We're proud of you. We've always been proud of you. We didn't know how to be proud of something we didn't understand. Voice carried a weight that suggested he was beginning to grasp not just the magnitude of my success, but the magnitude of their failure to recognize it. For 6 years, they'd been worried about me while I'd been building something that dwarfed any achievement in our family's history. But it was the group dynamics that were most revealing. By 4:45 p.m., according to messages I was receiving from Rebecca, the unified family front had completely fractured. The crisis that had brought them together in coordinated opposition to my supposed breakdown had been replaced by individual reckonings with their own assumptions and behavior. My mother was apparently going through old photo albums, looking for signs of my success that she'd missed. She'd found pictures from my housewarming party and was now recognizing details about the house's architecture and furnishings that should have indicated significant wealth. How did I miss this? She kept asking, according to Rebecca's report. My father was reviewing business cards and contacts I'd mentioned over the years, suddenly realizing that casual references to people I work with had actually been mentions of high-profile clients and industry leaders. The governor's chief of staff who had called during dinner wasn't a wrong number. It was someone who had my personal cell phone number for legitimate business reasons. Melissa was having what Rebecca described as a complete emotional breakdown, but not the kind my family had been expecting. Instead of relief at having her wedding crisis resolved, she was devastated by the realization of how thoroughly she'd misjudged and mistreated her own sister. She keeps saying, I told her she didn't deserve to be there, Rebecca texted. I told someone who owns venues that she wasn't good enough for my wedding. She's not crying about the wedding anymore. She's crying about what she did to you. Brandon was apparently in a state of shock that bordered on disbelief. He'd spent months positioning himself as the successful partner in a family that included someone he'd been led to believe was struggling professionally. Now he was discovering that his fiancé's sister was more successful than anyone he'd ever met personally. But it was the reaction of Brandon's parents that revealed the most about the social dynamics that had driven this entire situation. Eleanor and Richard Keller, who had spent the engagement period subtly expressing concern about being associated with a family that included someone they saw as unsuccessful, were now frantically trying to reposition themselves. According to a message from my Aunt Carol, Eleanor had spent an hour on the phone trying to understand exactly what kind of business empire I'd built. When she learned that Grandview Events had coordinated events for Fortune 500 companies and government officials, her tone had shifted from patronizing concern to something approaching reverence. She keeps asking if Sophia could coordinate events for Richard's dealership expansion, Carol reported. She went from thinking you were embarrassing the family to wanting to hire you for their business functions. The speed of Eleanor's transformation revealed exactly how transactional her original judgments had been. She hadn't been concerned about my personal well-being or family dynamics. She'd been concerned about social positioning. Now that my position had been revealed as higher than hers, her attitude had shifted accordingly. Richard's reaction was more straightforward but equally telling. He'd immediately started calculating the business implications of having a successful event planning executive in the family. His questions weren't about relationships or apologies. They were about potential partnerships and networking opportunities. He wants to know if you'd consider coordinating the grand opening for his new dealership location, my father had mentioned in his voicemail. He's talking about it like it would be a favor to him, but I think he's starting to understand that you'd be doing him the favor. The most devastating revelation came through my grandmother's reaction, as reported by my Aunt Linda. At 83, Grandmother Morrison had lived long enough to recognize patterns in family dynamics, and she was apparently the first person to fully grasp the long-term implications of what had been revealed. She keeps saying we lost her, Linda's message read. We lost Sophia years ago, and we were too busy judging her to notice. She understands that this isn't just about the wedding. It's about 6 years of dismissing someone who should have been celebrated. The business world was also reacting to the family drama in ways my relatives weren't anticipating. Marcus had fielded 3 calls from vendors who'd heard about the wedding situation and wanted to ensure their relationships with Grandview Events weren't affected by family conflicts. 2 of our corporate clients reached out after their contacts mentioned hearing about a family wedding crisis, Marcus reported in his 4:52 p.m. update. They want to make sure there are no operational issues that might affect their upcoming events. The idea that my family drama could impact Fortune 500 corporate events was a concept none of my relatives had considered. They were used to thinking about my work as something peripheral to real business, not realizing that my business decisions affected companies and organizations they'd recognize from national news. Jennifer Walsh had also called with a legal perspective that added another layer to the situation. Sophia, you should know that your family's public statements about your business capabilities and mental state could potentially be considered defamatory, given your actual professional standing. I'm not suggesting legal action, but you should be aware that their assumptions weren't just wrong. They were potentially damaging to someone in your position. The possibility that their intervention attempts could be seen as attacks on a legitimate business executive was something they'd never considered. They'd been so focused on their narrative of my failures that they hadn't thought about the implications of publicly questioning the competence of someone who actually ran a multi-million-dollar operation. By 5 p.m., exactly when I'd requested their decision about the wedding venue, I received a call from Marcus rather than from my family directly. Boss, I just got off the phone with the Morrison family. They want to accept your offer for Rosewood Estate with all the upgrades you mentioned. But they also asked me to tell you that they're hoping you'll reconsider attending the wedding. What did you tell them? I told them that attendance decisions were personal matters outside of my business purview, and that they should communicate directly with you about family issues. But Sophia, they sound different. Like they finally understand what they've been dealing with. Different. The family that had spent the morning organizing an intervention for my supposed breakdown had spent the afternoon discovering that they'd been intervening with someone who controlled more resources than any of them had ever imagined. The wedding would happen, more beautiful than originally planned, coordinated by world-class professionals, at a venue that represented the pinnacle of elegance in the region. And it would happen without the person whose success had made it all possible. Not because she wasn't invited, but because she'd chosen not to attend a celebration with people who had spent years celebrating her perceived failures. The immediate aftermath was complete. Their assumptions had been shattered, their social positioning had been revealed as illusory, and their family dynamics had been permanently altered by the discovery of who they'd actually been dealing with all along. 6 months after Melissa's wedding at Rosewood Estate, I sat in my office reviewing acquisition proposals for a boutique hotel chain in Northern California when my assistant announced that I had a visitor. My sister stood in the doorway of my executive suite, looking around at the floor-to-ceiling windows, the custom furniture, and the wall of awards and recognitions that told the story of Grandview Events' rise to industry leadership. "I've never actually seen your office," she said quietly. "I mean, I knew you had an office, but I imagined something like a cubicle in a shared workspace. This is incredible." The wedding had been beautiful, exactly as I'd promised. Rosewood Estate had provided the perfect backdrop for a celebration that exceeded every expectation Melissa and Brandon had originally held. The photographs had been featured in 2 regional magazines, and Eleanor Keller had spent months showing them to anyone who would look, proudly explaining that her son's wedding had been coordinated by one of the most exclusive event planning companies in the tri-state area. What she didn't mention in those conversations was that the exclusive event planning company was owned by the family member she'd once dismissed as unsuitable for the celebration. "How are you, Melissa?" I asked, gesturing for her to sit in one of the leather chairs that faced my desk. "How's married life?" "It's good. Really good. Brandon and I are happy." She paused, looking out the windows at the city skyline below. "But I didn't come here to talk about my marriage. I came to talk about what I did to my sister." The conversation I'd been expecting for months had finally arrived. In the immediate aftermath of the wedding revelation, family members had tried various approaches to rebuild their relationship with me. Some had attempted to act as if nothing had changed, treating me with the same casual dismissiveness they'd always used. Others had swung to the opposite extreme, suddenly treating me with an irreverence that felt almost as uncomfortable as their previous condescension. But Melissa had taken a different approach. She'd spent 6 months quietly observing, learning, and trying to understand who I actually was rather than who she'd assumed I was. Her questions during family gatherings had shifted from patronizing concern to genuine interest. She'd started asking about my work not to find problems to fix, but to actually understand what I did. "I've been doing research," she continued, "about your company, about the events you coordinate, about the industry you work in. Do you know what I discovered?" I waited, curious about what her investigation had revealed. "I discovered that my sister is one of the most respected event planners on the East Coast, that Fortune 500 companies compete to book events with your company, that you've coordinated celebrations for people whose names I recognize from business, magazines, and political news." She pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots she'd saved. "This article in Event Management Quarterly calls you a visionary who transformed luxury event planning through innovative client relationships and uncompromising attention to detail. This piece in Regional Business Review says Grandview Events sets the standard for high-end corporate and private celebrations." The articles were ones I remembered from various industry publications over the years. I'd never mentioned them to my family because I'd learned that sharing professional recognition only led to dismissive comments about local business magazines or suggestions that the recognition was inflated. But here's what really hit me, Melissa said, her voice becoming more emotional. I also discovered that you've been quietly donating to charities for years. The Children's Hospital Wing, the Scholarship Fund for First-Generation College Students, the small business development program that helped 3 women start their own companies. She paused, looking directly at me. You've been using your success to help other people, while your own family was assuming you needed help yourself. The charitable work was something I'd never discussed with family. It felt too personal, too important to risk having it diminished by their assumptions about my financial limitations. Knowing that Melissa had discovered it on her own, had recognized its significance, suggested that she was finally seeing me clearly. I keep thinking about that night at the rehearsal dinner, she continued. When I told everyone that you didn't fit the aesthetic I was going for, that your presence would make people uncomfortable. I was talking about someone who owns venues, that host events for governors and CEOs. I was worried about you embarrassing me in front of people who would probably be honored to meet you. The transformation in her understanding was complete, but more importantly, it was genuine. She wasn't trying to reposition herself for advantage or attempting to repair relationships for social reasons. She was confronting the reality of how badly she'd misjudged someone she should have known better than anyone. The worst part, she said, is that I convinced myself I was protecting you. I thought I was being kind by not putting you in situations where you'd feel out of place. I was so focused on your perceived inadequacies that I never noticed your actual achievements. This was the insight that mattered most. Melissa was recognizing that her behavior hadn't been driven by cruelty, but by a form of condescending kindness that was almost worse than deliberate malice. She'd been protecting me from situations where I was actually more qualified and accomplished than anyone else who would be present. I also need to tell you something about Brandon's parents, she continued. After they learned about your business, they spent weeks trying to figure out how to approach you about coordinating events for Richard's dealership expansion. They were too embarrassed by how they'd treated you to ask directly. I'd noticed the shift in Eleanor and Richard's behavior during family gatherings, but I hadn't realized they were interested in my professional services. The irony was perfect. The people who'd been concerned about their son marrying into a family with someone they saw as unsuccessful were now trying to hire that same person to elevate their own business events. Eventually, they asked me to ask you, Melissa said, which felt wrong on so many levels. They should ask you themselves, and they should probably start with an apology for how they treated you. What did you tell them? I told them that they'd have to deal with their own relationship issues with you, and that maybe they should consider why they felt comfortable dismissing you 6 months ago, but wanted to hire you now. The growth in Melissa's understanding extended beyond just recognizing my success. She was also understanding the social dynamics that had driven the family's behavior, and she was refusing to participate in the continued manipulation of relationships based on perceived status. I have a confession, she said. I've been watching how people treat you differently now that they know about your business. Some family members who ignored you for years suddenly want to include you in everything. Relatives who never asked about your work now want detailed updates about your latest projects. It's disgusting. The post-revelation attention had been one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the situation. People who'd been content to dismiss me were now overcorrecting, with excessive interest and forced inclusion. Their behavior revealed that their original dismissiveness and their current attention were both based on the same shallow calculations about status and advantage. But I also need to tell you something else, Melissa continued. Brandon and I have been talking about starting a family, and when we do, I want our children to know their aunt as she actually is, not as some version filtered through other people's assumptions. This was the conversation I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. Melissa was talking about rebuilding our relationship on the foundation of truth, rather than trying to repair the damage from the foundation of continued misunderstanding. I want them to know that their aunt is someone who built something amazing through intelligence and hard work. I want them to understand that success comes in many forms, and that some of the most impressive people are the ones who don't need to announce their achievements to feel validated. She paused, looking around my office again. And I want them to learn from my mistakes. I want them to understand that you should never assume someone's story based on surface appearances, and that family should be the first to celebrate each other's success, not the last to recognize it. The transformation was complete, but more importantly, it was being passed forward to the next generation. Melissa wasn't just apologizing for past behavior. She was committing to ensuring that future family dynamics would be based on curiosity and support, rather than assumption and judgment. "There's something I want to ask you," I said. "When you were planning your wedding, when you decided that I didn't fit what you wanted for your celebration, what did you think success looked like?" She considered the question carefully. I thought, success looked like having the right job title, wearing the right clothes, driving the right car, living in the right neighborhood. I thought it was about appearing successful to other people who I thought mattered. And now? Now I think success looks like building something meaningful, helping other people, and having the confidence to be yourself regardless of what other people think. I think success looks like my sister, who built a business empire while I was worried about whether she could afford nice shoes. As Melissa left my office that day, I realized that the most important outcome of the wedding crisis wasn't the revelation of my hidden success or the satisfaction of proving my family wrong. It was the possibility that our relationships could be rebuilt on the foundation of truth, understanding, and mutual respect. Success, I'd learned, isn't just about building wealth or achieving recognition. It's about maintaining your integrity. When people underestimate you, responding with grace when you have the power to respond with force, and remaining open to relationship repair when people demonstrate genuine growth. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving that people were wrong about you. Sometimes it's creating the opportunity for them to become the kind of people who would have been right about you all along. 2 years after the wedding that changed everything, I stood in the bridal suite at Rosewood Estate, adjusting the pearl necklace that had belonged to my grandmother Morrison, the same grandmother who had once lectured me about accepting responsibility for my failures. But today wasn't about the past. Today was about Rebecca, my cousin who had always suspected there was more to my story, and who was about to marry her longtime partner Sarah in what she'd specifically requested to be a celebration of authenticity over appearances. "I can't believe you're finally letting me see you work," Rebecca said, as I coordinated with the photographer about the timing for family portraits. "All these years, you've been this mysterious business owner, and now I get to watch the magic happen." The transformation in family dynamics over the past 2 years had been remarkable. What had started with Melissa's genuine apology and commitment to understanding had spread throughout the family like a positive contagion. People who had spent years making assumptions about each other had started asking actual questions. Conversations that had once been surface-level performance had become opportunities for real connection. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the family handled success itself. When my Uncle David had been promoted to partner at his law firm, instead of polite congratulations followed by private speculation about whether he deserved it, the family had thrown him a celebration and asked detailed questions about his journey to partnership. When my cousin James had published his first novel, instead of dismissive comments about the challenges of making money from writing, the family had organized a book launch party and bought copies for everyone they knew. They'd learned that celebration was more powerful than assumption, and that curiosity was more valuable than judgment. "You know what I love most about today?" Rebecca continued, watching through the window as guests arrived for her ceremony. "Everyone here knows exactly who everyone else is. No pretending, no assumptions, no performing. Just people who care about each other celebrating something real. The guest list was a perfect example of how the family had evolved. Eleanor and Richard Keller were in attendance, not because they were trying to network or position themselves socially, but because they genuinely developed a friendship with Rebecca and Sarah over the past 2 years. Brandon's pharmaceutical colleagues were sitting next to my Fortune 500 clients, not because anyone was trying to impress anyone else, but because both couples had built relationships based on authentic connection rather than social positioning. Even, the vendors reflected the new family dynamic. Instead of hiring services based on status or cost, Rebecca had chosen providers based on their ability to create the specific atmosphere she wanted. The florist was a local artist whose work she'd admired, not the most expensive option available. The caterer was a small business owner who specialized in farm-to-table cuisine, not the most prestigious company in the region. Sophia, my mother, appeared in the doorway, looking elegant in a dress that was beautiful without being flashy. Another sign of how the family's relationship with success had matured. The officiant is ready, and Sarah's parents just arrived. Is there anything you need us to handle? The question itself was revolutionary. Instead of assuming I was overwhelmed or offering help I hadn't requested, she was asking what I actually needed and trusting me to know my own requirements. It was a small interaction, but it represented years of learning to see me as I actually was, rather than as she'd assumed I was. Everything's on schedule, I replied. The ceremony will begin in 15 minutes, and Marcus has the reception coordination completely handled. Marcus had become something of a family favorite over the past 2 years. His professionalism and competence had helped the family understand exactly what kind of operation I'd been running all along. When he'd coordinated my father's retirement party 6 months ago, the precision and attention to detail had given everyone a clear picture of the standards Grandview Events maintained for every celebration. But the real transformation was visible in the smallest moments. When my grandmother Morrison had seen the linens and table settings, instead of commenting that they seemed expensive for a family party, she'd asked about the artistic choices behind the design. When the catering team had presented the menu, instead of worrying about costs, the family had focused on how the food would contribute to the overall experience. They'd learned to appreciate excellence without anxiety, and to celebrate quality without guilt. There's something I want to tell you, Rebecca said as I made final adjustments to her veil. This whole experience, watching you handle everything so beautifully, seeing how respected you are in your industry, understanding what you've built, it's changed how I think about my own career. Rebecca worked as a graphic designer for a marketing firm and had always been somewhat apologetic about her creative work, as if art wasn't as valuable as more traditional business success. I've started taking on freelance projects, she continued, building my own client base, developing my own artistic vision. I realized that I'd been doing the same thing to myself that we all did to you, assuming that what I was doing wasn't significant enough to be considered real success. This was the most meaningful outcome of the entire experience. The family's transformation hadn't just been about recognizing my achievements. It had been about recognizing the value of different kinds of success, different paths to fulfillment, and different ways of contributing to the world. I'm proud of you, I said, and meant it completely. Building something of your own takes courage. I learned that from watching you, she replied. You never let anyone else define what success looked like for you, even when it would have been easier to just accept their limitations. As the ceremony began, I watched from the back of the venue as Rebecca and Sarah exchanged vows that they'd written themselves, words about authenticity, acceptance, and the courage to be fully known by another person. The parallels to the family's journey weren't lost on anyone present. During the reception, I found myself in conversation with Eleanor Keller, who had become an unexpected ally in the family's transformation. You know, she said, I've been thinking about that rehearsal dinner 2 years ago, and I owe you an apology that goes beyond what I said at the time. Eleanor, we've moved past that. No, I don't think we have. Not completely. Because I need to acknowledge that my behavior wasn't just about social positioning. It was about fear. This was a conversation I hadn't expected. Fear of what? Fear that my assumptions about success were wrong. Fear that the metrics I'd been using to judge people's worth weren't actually meaningful. When I looked at you and saw someone I thought was struggling, it confirmed my belief that I understood how the world worked. She paused, looking around at the celebration surrounding us. When I learned who you actually were, it forced me to question everything else I thought I knew, and that was terrifying, because it meant admitting that I might be wrong about a lot of people, including myself. The honesty was stunning and revelatory. Eleanor was acknowledging that her dismissal of me had been about protecting her own worldview, rather than making accurate assessments about my life. But here's what I've learned, she continued. Being wrong about you was the best thing that could have happened to me, because it taught me to be curious instead of judgmental. It taught me that assumption is the enemy of understanding. As the evening continued, I realized that the story that had begun with my family's assumptions about my failures had transformed into something much more significant. A lesson about the power of authentic relationships, the danger of surface-level judgments, and the possibility that even the most entrenched patterns of behavior could change when people committed to seeing each other clearly. The wedding that had revealed my hidden success had ultimately led to something more valuable than recognition or vindication. It had led to the kind of family relationships I'd always wanted but never thought were possible. Relationships based on truth, curiosity, and genuine celebration of each other's achievements. As I watched Rebecca and Sarah dance their first dance as a married couple, surrounded by family members who were finally seeing each other clearly, I understood that sometimes the greatest success isn't what you build in spite of other people's limitations. Sometimes it's what you build by helping them transcend those limitations entirely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.